For 80 years, we believed the sea belonged to everyone. That belief died in 2026. We were told the modern world had left the physical behind. That power had become weightless, digital, invisible, signals in the air, data in a cloud. A civilization that no longer had to touch the ground. It was a comforting story, and it was a lie. Because in the first months of 2026, something happened that the experts had called impossible for 2 generations. The ship stopped. Not slowed, stopped. In one narrow channel between Iran and Arabia, a stretch of water barely wider than a large city, the traffic that normally carries a fifth of the world's oil fell to almost nothing. On a single day that spring, exactly 1 commercial vessel made the crossing. The normal number is closer to 140. And at the same time, on the far side of the Arabian Peninsula, the gateway to the Suez Canal had already been bleeding ships for 2 years. The great container lines were sailing the long way around Africa, adding thousands of miles and weeks to voyages that used to be routine. 2 of the planet's most important arteries constricting in the same year. And most people never understood why their prices were climbing, or where any of it began. Here is the truth the comfortable story hides. Even now, even in an age of satellites and artificial intelligence, more than 80% of everything the world trades still moves the oldest way there is, by sea, in steel hulls across salt water. And those hulls are not free to wander the open ocean, to connect the world's factories to the world's buyers. They are funneled, squeezed, through a handful of impossibly narrow passages. In the language of strategy, these are called choke points. A few miles of water, each one holding the entire modern economy hostage to geography. For most of living memory, an invisible hand kept those passages open. You never saw it. You only felt the result. Shelves that were always full, fuel that always flowed, a world that simply worked. In 2026, that hand began to let go. This is the story of the narrowest places on Earth, of a system we built on a single, unspoken assumption that the sea would always be open, and of what happens when that assumption breaks. For decades, strategists ran that breakage as a war game. On paper. This year, the world started running it for real, which leaves one question. When the arteries close and the pressure builds and the whole structure begins to bleed, who holds the tourniquet? The answer, as you'll see, is more frightening than the closure itself. To understand why a few miles of water can shake the entire global economy, you have to understand the machine that economy runs on. That machine has a name: just-in-time. Just-in-time manufacturing is the logistical backbone of the 21st century. In many ways, it is an engineering marvel, a philosophy of ruthless efficiency in which a factory holds almost no inventory at all. Parts arrive exactly when they are needed, not a day sooner. Warehouses shrink, costs fall, capital moves faster. For decades, this system made goods cheaper and companies richer. But efficiency and resilience are opposites, and just-in-time buys its efficiency by spending its resilience down to almost nothing. Consider an automobile plant in the American Midwest. It does not keep months of components on hand. In many cases, it keeps hours. It depends on a continuous conveyor belt of deliveries stretching back across oceans. A specialized chip from Taiwan, a wiring harness from Southeast Asia, a chemical catalyst from a refinery in the Gulf. each piece timed to arrive at the exact moment the assembly line reaches for it. When that belt runs smoothly, it is invisible. When a single link breaks, the system does not slow down gracefully. The buffers evaporate in hours, and the line stops. One missing component, trapped on a ship anchored off a distant coast, can freeze an entire factory thousands of miles away. This is the hidden fragility beneath modern life. Our manufacturing is no longer national. It is synchronous, global, and balanced on the assumption that the physical path from supplier to factory will never be cut. Now look at where those paths actually run. The world's oceans are enormous, but the efficient routes across them are not. To move cargo between the manufacturing centers of Asia, the energy fields of the Middle East, and the markets of Europe and America, ships are drawn again and again through the same small number of gaps in the map. The Strait of Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, the Bab el-Mandeb at the foot of the Red Sea, the Strait of Malacca between Malaysia and Indonesia, the Suez and Panama canals cut by human hands, a short list of waterways, not one of them wide, that together carry the lifeblood of the entire system. These are the choke points, and their power comes precisely from their narrowness. A wide sea cannot be closed. A 2-mile channel can. Consider how completely this touches your ordinary day. The coffee in your kitchen, the fuel in your tank, the lithium in your phone battery, the medicine in your cabinet, the steel in your car. Almost none of it was made where you bought it. Each item is the end of a long thread that runs back at some point through one of these narrow gates. You never see the thread. You only notice it exists on the day it snaps. And we have already seen in miniature what a single snapped thread can do. In 2021, one oversized container ship, the Ever Given, turned sideways and wedged itself across the Suez Canal. Not an attack, not a war, just wind and a navigation error. For 6 days, one of the world's busiest arteries was completely blocked, and the estimated damage to global trade ran into the billions of dollars per day. 6 days by accident. Now hold that number in your mind, and imagine a strait closed not for 6 days by accident, but for months on purpose. For 80 years, one force guaranteed that these passages stayed open, regardless of who happened to be fighting whom nearby. But in 2026, that guarantee was tested in the most direct way imaginable, and it did not hold cleanly. When one of these straits was shut, the most powerful navy in the history of the world could not simply sail in and reopen it in a week. It took months, and even then, the water never fully returned to what it had been. Hold that question in your mind because it sits under everything that follows. If a superpower cannot quickly reopen a single strait, then what exactly is keeping all the others open? We will come back to it, but first we have to walk the arteries themselves. Because to understand the danger, you have to see just how much of your ordinary life depends on water you have never heard of. And we will start where the pressure broke first. We will start with oil. Sadio. Begin with the Strait of Hormuz. It sits between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, and it is the only maritime gateway into the Persian Gulf, the exit door for the oil of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, the Emirates, and Iran itself. In an ordinary year, roughly 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum liquids pass through it every single day. That is about a fifth of the world's petroleum consumption, and around a quarter of all oil that moves by sea. For most of that volume, there is no pipeline that can take its place, and the geography is merciless. At the working part of the strait, the shipping lanes are only about 2 miles wide in each direction, running inside the territorial waters of Iran and Oman. A single disabled tanker in the wrong place can, for practical purposes, jam the whole passage. It is a choke point in the purest sense of the word. For decades, that vulnerability stayed theoretical. In 2026, it stopped being theoretical. In late February, the United States and Israel launched a wave of strikes against Iran, strikes that, among other things, killed Iran's supreme leader. In response, Iran did the thing analysts had warned about for 40 years. It moved to close the Strait of Hormuz. Its Revolutionary Guard warned vessels away, boarded and attacked merchant ships, and laid sea mines in the channel. The effect was almost instant. Tanker traffic, normally around 140 ships a day, collapsed toward zero. Roughly a couple of thousand ships found themselves stranded in the Gulf, unable to safely leave. Over the following weeks, international bodies confirmed dozens of attacks on vessels, and more than a dozen seafarers, ordinary crew, not soldiers, were killed. This is worth saying plainly without drama. The abstraction of supply chain risk was paid for in human lives. The markets reacted the way trapped systems always do. The price of Brent crude jumped from around $70 a barrel to the mid-90s within days and kept climbing. To hold the world economy together, the International Energy Agency ordered the single largest coordinated release of emergency oil reserves in its history, 400 million barrels. And here is the detail that matters most for our story. Reopening the strait was not quick, and it was not clean. It took a months-long military campaign, a naval blockade of Iranian ports, and finally a negotiated agreement in the summer before traffic even began to trickle back. Even then, crossing stayed far below normal. Attacks flared again into the summer, and industry estimates for a full return of flows reached all the way into 2027. The most powerful navy on Earth could not simply switch the ocean back on. There were winners in the chaos, which is its own kind of lesson. As Gulf oil struggled to reach the market, other producers stepped into the gap. Over the first months of the crisis, the United States, now a major exporter in its own right, saw its energy revenues climb by tens of billions of dollars. Russia, selling steadily into a frightened market, gained billions more. Meanwhile, the Gulf states that could not bypass the strait watched their revenues fall. A crisis in one narrow channel had quietly redrawn the balance sheet of the entire energy world. And the supposed escape routes proved thin. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates do have pipelines that skirt around Hormuz, but together they can carry only a fraction of the oil the strait normally moves. For everyone else on the Gulf, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, there is essentially no way out but through. That is what a true choke point means, not merely important, but irreplaceable. China, watching all of this from the far end of the supply line, has spent years quietly building the largest strategic oil stockpile on Earth, a buffer against exactly this kind of squeeze. It is the behavior of a giant that knows precisely where its own throat is exposed. Now travel southwest to a strait the mariners once named the Gate of Grief, the Bab el-Mandeb. It is the southern doorway of the Red Sea, only about 20 miles wide, and it is the hinge of the Suez shortcut that binds Asia to Europe. In a normal year, something like 12 to 15% of all global trade, and close to a third of the world's container traffic, threads through it. To grasp why this shortcut matters so much, picture the alternative. The Suez Canal, cut through Egypt in 1869, is the reason a ship leaving Asia can reach Europe without sailing all the way around Africa. It saves something like 4,000 miles. Take Suez away by closing the gate that guards its southern approach, and every one of those ships is forced back onto the old, punishing route around the Cape of Good Hope, the way sailors traveled before the canal existed. The modern world, it turns out, is one strait away from 19th century geography. But since late 2023, this gate has been under fire. Houthi forces in Yemen began striking commercial ships with missiles, drones, and naval mines. The attacks made the route effectively uninsurable at normal rates, and so the great container lines Maersk, MSC, Hapag-Lloyd did something extraordinary. They abandoned the shortcut entirely and sent their fleets the long way around the Cape of Good Hope. That single decision reshaped global logistics. The detour adds thousands of nautical miles and 10 to 14 days to every affected voyage and burns roughly $1 million in extra fuel each trip. Traffic through the Suez Canal fell to a fraction of its former level. Daily transits at the Bab el-Mandeb dropped from around 70 ships to a handful. And when the 2026 war reignited the region, the carriers that had cautiously crept back fled around Africa once again. There is a modern twist here too. Most ships broadcast their position on a public transponder system called AIS, the system that is supposed to keep the sea safe. In these waters, that safety system has been turned into a weapon. Vessels now go dark, switching their transponders off to hide. Others are electronically spoofed, made to appear somewhere they are not. The very tool built to prevent collisions has become a tool of concealment and denial. Two very different straits, one for energy, one for finished goods, and the same lesson from both. When a choke point is threatened, the damage is not delivered by explosions alone. It is delivered by a quieter machine, insurance. Almost every serious cargo that crosses these waters is underwritten by the marine insurance market, centered in London. When risk rises, the underwriters price it, and they do not price it gently. In peacetime, war risk cover for a Hormuz transit costs a tiny fraction of a ship's value. During the 2026 crisis, that premium climbed toward 5% of the hull. For a supertanker, a swing of hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single crossing. And there is a harder edge beyond price. When the risk becomes unquantifiable, underwriters simply stop writing cover at all. A ship without insurance cannot legally or financially sail. That is a blockade enforced not by warships, but by spreadsheets. A financial closure that needs no shot to be fired. This is also why the old legal categories no longer protect us. In international law, a formal blockade is an act of war with all the consequences that follow. But the disruptions of the 2020s rarely bother with formality. A scattering of mines, a swarm of drones no one will claim, a cyber intrusion into a port's navigation system, a tanker seized for inspection. Each stays just below the threshold of declared war, and each still freezes trade. To a ship's captain, it makes no difference whether a lawyer would call an act a war crime or a nuisance. If his insurance is voided the moment he enters the danger zone, he turns around, and the supply chain breaks. Every one of those costs, the fuel, the detour, the premium, the delay, is injected back into the global supply chain. It does not vanish. It reappears weeks later and an ocean away as inflation, hidden inside the price of a car, a phone, a bag of groceries, paid by people who will never hear the word Bab el-Mandeb in their lives. There is a strategic sting in this too. The countries hurt most by a closed choke point are rarely the ones doing the closing. When Hormuz shut, the United States, now energy independent enough to absorb the blow, felt only a fraction of the pain, while its closest partners in Asia, utterly dependent on Gulf oil, took the shock full in the chest. A choke point, in the wrong hands, is not just a valve on trade, it is a lever on alliances, a way to punish a rival by quietly squeezing the friends who lean on it. That is what makes these narrow waters far more dangerous than a simple map suggests. And yet, for all the damage these two arteries have absorbed, neither of them is the one that could truly end the system. There is a third strait, larger, busier, carrying not just oil, but the manufactured output of half the planet, and one nation, the second largest economy on Earth, lives in permanent fear of it. Its own strategists have a name for that fear. We are about to hear it. Stop. Step back from the maps and the numbers for a moment and ask a question we've been circling since the beginning. For 80 years, the world had choke points just as narrow and rivalries just as bitter. And yet global trade did not collapse into a knife fight over every mile of ocean. Why not? What exactly was holding it all together? The answer is a force so constant that most people never knew it was there. Call it the invisible shield. After 1945, the United States made a choice that quietly rewrote the physics of global commerce. It stopped behaving like a regional power and became the guarantor of the global commons, the open ocean that belongs to no single nation. Through carrier strike groups in the Gulf, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific, the U.S. Navy underwrote the safety of everyone's shipping, not just its own. A car maker in Bavaria, an electronics assembler in Vietnam, a soybean farmer in Brazil, all of them could plan their entire businesses on one assumption, that the sea would be open and safe and cheap to cross. And the genius of it was that it was invisible. You never saw the destroyers. You never saw the guided missile cruisers or the radar systems tracking threats in the dark. You only saw the results, the full shelves, the low prices, the package that arrived on time. This shield is the thing that made just-in-time possible in the first place. When the ocean is de-risked by someone else's navy, you can afford to keep only hours of inventory. The whole miracle of modern efficiency was quietly leaning on a single guarantor. It is worth being honest about the scale of what this required. For 8 decades, the United States chose to pay for a navy far larger than its own borders strictly needed, a fleet whose real day job was patrolling everyone else's trade routes. It was, in effect, a subsidy the world barely noticed it was receiving. The American taxpayer quietly underwriting the safe passage of German cars, Chinese electronics, and Middle Eastern oil across seas those countries could never have secured alone. That arrangement held for exactly one reason. The United States believed an open, predictable ocean was worth the cost, because an open ocean was the foundation of the entire order it had built and led. The shield was never really about ships. It was about a belief. And the moment that belief wavers, the ships mean less than you'd think. Which brings us back to 2026, and to the moment the shield became visible. Because a shield only becomes visible when it is struck. When Iran closed Hormuz, the world watched the guarantor try to do the thing everyone assumed it could always do: reopen the sea. And it was hard. It took a sustained air campaign. It took a naval blockade of Iran's own ports. It took the killing of the Iranian commander running the blockade. And still, after all of that, the strait did not snap back to normal. Full flows were pushed into the following year. For the first time in living memory, the utility flickered, and everyone could see it flicker. To understand why, you have to understand a distinction the admirals lived by: the difference between presence and control. A single warship can be present across a wide stretch of ocean, but it can only truly control the water within a limited radius around itself. Spread that navy thin enough across the Arctic, the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Gulf all at once, and the presence becomes a thin film. Gaps open between the patrols, and in those gaps, others begin to test what is real. The threat itself has also changed shape. The Pax Americana was built to win a battle between fleets, but the danger now is not another fleet. It is denial. Cheap, distributed, deniable. A few mines, a cluster of drones, an anti-ship missile fired from a pickup truck on a shoreline. Weapons that cost a rounding error compared to the ships they threaten. The shield was designed for one kind of war and is now being probed by another. And there is a deeper problem the maps never show: the ability to build and repair the fleet in the first place. Warships cannot be summoned overnight. They take years, and they take shipyards. Over the same decades that American naval commitments grew, its shipbuilding base shrank, while a single rival, China, built by far the largest shipbuilding industry on the planet, capable of launching hulls at a pace the United States can no longer match. A shield is only as durable as the forge behind it, and the forge, quietly, has been moving east for a generation. There is a psychological dimension to all of this too, and it may be the most important part of the whole story. Deterrence is not made of steel. It is made of belief. For 80 years, no one seriously tested the American guarantee at the great choke points. Not because they couldn't reach the water, but because they didn't believe they could win. The value of the shield was never in using it. It was in the fact that no one dared make it necessary. But belief is a fragile thing. Let the world watch the Guarantor struggle just once to reopen a single strait. Let them see the strain, the months, the negotiation, the limits, and the quiet calculation in a dozen capitals begins to change. What was unthinkable becomes merely difficult. And what becomes merely difficult sooner or later gets tried. So here is the turn, the hinge of this entire story. The shield is still there. The U.S. Navy is still, by far, the most powerful on Earth. But it is no longer invisible, and it is no longer everywhere at once. And the instant a guarantee becomes visible, the instant the world can see the guarantor straining, is the exact instant that others start asking whether the guarantee still holds. In 2026, they started asking out loud, if the shield is straining, the obvious question is, strained by what? The answer is a transformation in the physics of sea power itself, quiet, structural, and already well underway. Start with simple arithmetic. The U.S. Navy still fields the greatest tonnage and the most advanced carriers in existence, but its battle fleet numbers under 300 ships spread across a map that grows more contested every year. The commitments keep expanding: a newly tense Pacific, a returning Atlantic, a warming and opening Arctic, a burning Gulf, while the number of hulls to cover them does not keep pace. You cannot be everywhere with a fixed number of ships and an infinite number of places that suddenly matter. None of this means American power is finished. It means American power is now rationed. every ship sent to force open a strait in the Gulf is a ship not watching the Pacific. Every month spent breaking a blockade in one sea is a month of open opportunity in another. Power that must be rationed is power that must choose. And every choice, by definition, leaves something else uncovered. Into that gap has come a new doctrine, and it has a clinical name: anti-access area denial. The idea is not to defeat a superpower's navy in open battle. That is hopeless. The idea is to make the cost of operating in a given sea so high that even a superpower decides it isn't worth it. Swarms of cheap anti-ship missiles, ground-based radar and sensors, naval mines, underwater drones. A weapon costing a few $1,000,000 can now credibly threaten a warship costing billions. And we no longer have to imagine whether this works, because in 2026 it was demonstrated in full view. Iran, a nation whose navy is a fraction of America's, used mines and drones to shut one of the world's most important straits, kill seafarers, and hold the global oil market hostage for months. The reopening had to be negotiated, not simply imposed. That is the whole doctrine, proven in public. And that is the answer to the question we left hanging at the very start: why the most powerful navy on Earth could not just reopen a strait in a week. Against cheap, distributed denial, raw power is slow and expensive and never quite decisive. Think about what that exchange rate does to a superpower's choices. Every aircraft carrier is a floating city, decades in the making, worth more than the entire military of many nations. Every drone that can threaten it might be assembled in a warehouse for the price of a luxury car. When cheap can credibly hunt expensive, the expensive thing has to be used cautiously, held back, kept safe, kept out of the very waters it was built to command. The most powerful navy in history can still win almost any battle it chooses to fight. The trouble is that its rivals have stopped trying to fight battles at all and started trying to make whole seas too expensive to enter. There is a second tactic, subtler still. Fleets of ordinary-looking fishing boats, a maritime militia, repurposed for surveillance, for swarming, for harassment. Gray hulls that blur the line between a civilian vessel and a combatant and exhaust a conventional navy that was never designed to fight ambiguity. You do not need to sink a fleet to control a sea. You only need to make operating there cost more than the trade is worth. Do that, and open seas stops being the default state of the world. It becomes a privilege, granted or withheld, by whoever is physically present and willing to assert control. Which brings us at last to the third artery, and to the fear I promised you a name for. It is the Strait of Malacca, running between Malaysia and Indonesia, narrowing at one point to under 2 miles. It is the busiest choke point on the planet, carrying roughly a quarter of everything the world trades by sea. Not only oil, but the manufactured goods that move between Asia and everyone else. And it is the single greatest vulnerability of the second largest economy on Earth, China. China is now the world's largest importer of oil, and a vast share of that oil, along with much of its trade, must pass through Malacca, a strait that Beijing does not control, and that a rival navy could, in theory, close. China's own strategists gave this nightmare a name years ago. They call it the Malacca Dilemma. To a rising power, the idea that your entire ascent depends on a 2-mile gap another nation's ships could plug is not an inconvenience. It is intolerable. Beijing has spent a fortune trying to escape the trap. Pipelines through Myanmar to carry oil over land and skip the strait. A deep water port in Pakistan, at Gwadar, reaching toward the Gulf. Railways and highways stitched across Central Asia, the Great Belt and Road, all of it in part an attempt to breathe without Malacca's permission. But the arithmetic is unforgiving. A pipeline carries a trickle next to the flood a fleet of supertankers delivers. No overland route yet built, or seriously planned, can replace the sheer volume and the low cost of the maritime funnel. Geography, once again, refuses to be bought, and a nation that cannot build its way out of a vulnerability is left with only one other option: to control the vulnerability itself. China is hardly the first rising power to feel this particular claustrophobia. The United States once obsessed over the Panama Canal in almost identical terms, a single dredged channel that, if closed, could sever its Pacific and Atlantic fleets from each other for weeks. Washington spent the better part of a century making sure no rival could ever hold that leverage over it. Beijing is running the same playbook today, just 3 generations later, with a 2-mile strait instead of a 50-mile canal. The anxiety is not new. Only the map has changed. And here is the escalation that should make you sit forward. Through the spring of 2026, while the world's attention and a great deal of the U.S. Navy was pinned down reopening Hormuz, another move was reportedly made quietly on the far side of Asia. In the South China Sea, along the approaches that feed toward Malacca, China moved to tighten its grip on a contested reef called the Scarborough Shoal. In the moment, a small thing. In the pattern, everything. It is exactly what strategists had feared. When the Guarantor is pinned in one theater, the pressure is applied in another. A vacuum, once open, does not stay empty. It gets filled. For decades, strategists ran a wargame on paper. The question was always the same. What happens if the great choke points close at once? In 2026, we no longer had to imagine the opening act. Hormuz showed us. So let us do what the strategists do and run the model forward all the way to the artery that has not yet broken, Malacca. What follows is a scenario, a risk model, not a prophecy. But every stage of it is built on mechanisms we have already watched operate this year. Days 1 to 5, the logistical shock. The moment transit through Malacca stops, the global supply chain does not break, it freezes. Just in time, remember, holds hours of inventory, not months. The buffers evaporate almost immediately. Factories across the American Midwest, waiting on components trapped on ships off Singapore, begin to stall within days. We saw the leading edge of exactly this when Hormuz closed. Now imagine it on the artery that carries finished goods, not just fuel. Day 10, the energy feedback loop. Oil markets, already scarred by a year of disruption, react to fresh fear with fresh violence. And this is not only the price at the pump. It is the cost of power for the industrial grid, the data centers, the cold chain, the water plants. When Hormuz shut this year, Brent leapt from around $70 to the mid-90s in days. That was one strait. The model compounds from there. Day 20, the inventory desert and a quieter emergency beneath it. Store shelves, optimized for constant replenishment, show their gaps. But the deeper danger is pharmaceutical. A large share of the active ingredients in modern medicine is manufactured in Asia and shipped along these very lanes. Drugs with short shelf lives begin to thin out of hospital supply. This is the stage, and again, this is modeled risk, not a forecast, where the crisis stops being about the economy and starts being about the household. Day 30, the systemic rupture. By now, the world has stopped hoping for a quick fix and begun grimly to reorganize around scarcity. And the final blow is the one we already watched land in miniature this year. The insurance market goes dark. Faced with risk it cannot price, it refuses to price at all. Without cover, ships cannot sail. The global fleet sits idle in neutral ports, paralyzed not by a physical blockade, but by a financial one. In 2026, roughly 2,000 ships sat stranded because of a single closed strait. The model simply asks what happens when it is the strait that carries a quarter of world trade. Day 45, the diplomatic freeze. By now, every power capable of ending this owns a piece of why it hasn't ended. Emergency sessions convene and adjourn without resolution, because resolution would require someone to blink first, and blinking in this environment reads as weakness no government can afford to show its own public. Historians will later argue about the exact day the crisis stopped being a supply chain problem and became a test of which country could outweight the others. Inside the model, there is no such clean date. There is only the slow realization across 100 trading floors and a dozen capitals that waiting has become the strategy. Weeks 6 to 12, the reordering. By this stage, the crisis stops behaving like an emergency and starts behaving like a new equilibrium. Contracts renegotiate around the disruption instead of waiting for it to end. Shippers who can afford it begin routing around the strait entirely, weeks longer, dramatically more expensive but predictable, which by now is worth more than fast. Governments that spent the first month calling this temporary spend the next two quietly rewriting their industrial policy around it. This is the part of the model the strategists find hardest to wargame because it has no clean ending. A closed strait is a single event with a single fix. Reopen it. A reordered world is not an event. It is the new shape of things, and nobody gets to vote on whether they like it. And notice what makes this different from every dress rehearsal before it. In the past, a choke point crisis was a single emergency the world could rally to solve, because everyone agreed it should be solved, and one power had the means to solve it. The 2026 model breaks both halves of that assumption at once. The means are no longer decisive. Cheap denial has seen to that. And the agreement is gone because the powers who could act now each have their own reasons to let the pressure continue. When the firefighters begin to disagree about whether the fire is useful, the fire is no longer the real danger. The disagreement is, and now we can answer the question this whole story has been holding since the first minute. When the arteries close and the structure begins to bleed, who holds the tourniquet? For 80 years, one hand did. In 2026, that hand proved it could no longer close a wound quickly and alone, and no single replacement has stepped forward to take its place. Instead, the tourniquet is being pulled at by several hands at once. Washington, Beijing, Tehran, and the smaller actors who have learned that a few cheap weapons can hold a strait hostage. That is the frightening answer. Not that the wrong hand holds the tourniquet, that no single hand does. A wound with no one clearly responsible for closing it is the most dangerous wound of all. This is not a prophecy of collapse. It is an X-ray of the thing we actually built, a civilization that runs on constant, uninterrupted motion, optimized down to the hour for cost, and never once optimized for a contested world. Remove the motion and the structure does not merely stop, it tears at the seams. In 2026, for the first time in 80 years, we saw the first seam tear. The only real question left is where the next one begins. So what do we take from all of this? We built a world of breathtaking efficiency on one quiet, unspoken bet: that the sea would always be open. For 80 years it was a safe bet. Cheap goods, full shelves, a global machine humming on the assumption that no one would ever pull the narrow threads that held it together. In 2026, that bet stopped being safe. The Straits, those forgotten, unglamorous 2-mile places, reached up and reminded the most advanced economies in history that geography was never actually conquered. It was only, for a while, guaranteed. Empires have made this exact bet before, and paid for it in exactly this coin. Britain once treated the Suez Canal as sacred ground, not because of the ditch itself, but because it was the artery to everything the empire actually needed: oil, troops, trade with the East. When Egypt nationalized it in 1956, the crisis that followed did not just cost Britain a canal, it cost Britain the last of its illusion that it still ran the world. The lesson was not that choke points matter. Everyone already knew that. The lesson was that no guarantee lasts longer than the power that issued it assumes it will. Here is the question worth arguing about, and I genuinely want to read your answer below. In a world where a handful of cheap drones can close an artery that a superpower struggles for months to reopen, is the age of the open sea already over? And if it is, who should hold the tourniquet? Do we want a single guarantor again, whatever the cost of being the world's navy? Or is a world with no single hand on the wound simply the price we pay for a multipolar age? Tell me where you land. I read the comments. Because while the whole world watched the Gulf burn in 2026, the most consequential move of the year may have been the quietest one, made half an ocean away, on a small contested reef in the South China Sea, along the approaches to the one strait that could truly end the system: Malacca. That is where this story goes next. Every system that ever dominated the world eventually had to answer the same question: what comes after? For 80 years, the sea belonged to everyone. What comes after, who inherits the open ocean, and at what price, is being decided right now in the narrowest places on Earth, and almost